Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Anything But Bollywood, where we talk to creators, filmmakers, and curators of the moving images. But it's with one condition, that they be working in spheres that are anything but Bollywood. So having said that, Bollywood is this ginormous monster that devours everything that's in its path, and we're podcasting out of Mumbai, so we will invariably bump into people who have a toe or a finger or a foot in Bollywood. So to deal with this contentious issue, we're introducing you to our Anything But Bollywood scoring, also known as ABS. So an Anand Patwardhan gets a 10-pack and Salman Khan gets a 0-pack. So our guest this week scores a 10-pack AB rating. He has had a film at the Berlin Film Festival that was hugely praised because it was controversial, and then it went on to be banned. His latest film played at Sundance and then got picked up in a 7-figure deal by Netflix. With his films, you can definitely play Spot the Penis. He has one letter for a name. He is Q. Hi Q, welcome to the show.
Hello.
So I wanted to start by asking you how your journey into filmmaking began. You grew up in Calcutta, and then how did you make this?
Obviously, I have lived for some time, so the story is long. We shall try to be brief about it. I grew up in Calcutta in a middle-class sort of environment with a very hardcore communist father. Which meant that everything American or anything Bollywood was, there was no Bollywood at that point, but Hindi things were not allowed in the house.
Oh.
Which meant that I did not know who Mickey Mouse was till I was 12.
Wow.
And slowly, though, all these pop culture phenomenons that people have grown up with, I started having to deal with them in my teenage years, which drove me completely mad. So by the time I was 15, I had lost the plot completely.
So were you allowed to watch anything?
Yeah. Of course. I watched, for instance, the Moscow Olympics.
Okay.
Yeah. I read everything Russian.
Okay.
From Dostoevsky to Vera Chaplin. I had my own comic book series, Batul the Great, and in Bengali, and Misha in Russian.
Your own series as in?
Comics,
Okay.
Since I couldn't get Disney,
right.
there were Russian comics that were steadily and steadfastly translated in Bengali, and it used to reach our place. So that was my fodder. My mom and my mom's sisters, there were many women in my vicinity. I was mostly around women, and these guys were always trying to sneak out and catch a Hindi film. So in order for me not to tell my dad, I was sort of hustled into Hindi film screenings, noon shows. I never liked them, weirdly, because by then already my aesthetics were possibly, infiltrated by my dad. So a long time later, I was in advertising, sort of taking revenge on this communist upbringing by getting into advertising, spending a long time there. I ended up in Sri Lanka. And I was working there for quite some time. I used to live in this Tamil locality, and one day, while picking up some bhujia, I chanced upon this video store. And like a lot of other brilliant filmmakers of our times, I was totally trained inside a video parlor. So it was really one tape, a VHS tape of this film called Run Lola Run by Tom Ticker, who I had no clue existed at that point. And I just picked up the DVD the video because of the cover. On the cover, there was Franca Potente running, and she had
red hair. Right.
And I also had red hair at that point. So I thought that, okay, this will have my kind of music. I was totally into electronica at that point of time. And sure enough, it did. Also, I was in advertising. I was an executive creative director at that point of time, and I used to direct commercials.
So executive, so you were in
an agency.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a great job where I could be in the agency and also make commercials for the agency, of course. But I could choose my commercials to direct. I was already directing a lot without having absolutely any interest in filmmaking. Okay, so the technical knowledge sort of came in through practice, which was purely out of curious interest, I would say. Nothing passionate. There was no passion involved. There was no interest, real interest. It was just curiosity. But Run Lola Run suddenly shifted that. I think it happened because I realized I could never relate to classical films, even the most out there ones. I just could not relate to it because the medium itself did not seem very interesting for me. Whereas suddenly with Run Lola Run, and then I chanced upon the Dogma movement, and the early inspiration was all European, mostly Nordic or German or East European at best. And they were having a revolution that time, in the mid-90s. And that came to me suddenly through that strange Tamil video parlor. This completely shifted my idea of what films could achieve, because these films were political, they were full of music, they were totally taking on the classical sense of aesthetics. They were almost always not being shot on film, So with my Handycam, I started experimenting a little, and I realized that this could be something that I could do.
And that choice to do advertising, how did that come about?
It was the easiest thing for a person who's a failure. Advertising is full of failures. All big advertising people want to do something else, like write a book or make a film or something. This is because advertising is a sort of fallback profession, I think, at least to my knowledge.
And at the time you were a failure because?
Because I've always been a loser. I could never be anything. I used to play tennis, I used to sing, I used to do everything, but never very good, I could never win the tournament. I was always the also-ran. So I think, and I was pretty okay with it, which is what sort of culminated in Gandu, which is the celebration of the loser.
Yeah, so I want to talk about Gandu, but before that, you made a documentary film,
yes,
which was Love in India, and that was a culmination of a very personal relationship in your life, along with bleeding into your film.
Yeah.
So could you talk about that whole relationship and how that film came about, and why did you choose at that point to make this documentary, which is a form then you've not really, I think, taken on after that?
So I came back to India in 2001 from Sri Lanka, and I tried to make this film, which was my first attempt at this idea that I already had. I was very, very interested in documentaries already. I had watched a lot of that. Also, how the form of documentary filmmaking was shifting very, very quickly at that time because of the technology. Suddenly, there were video cameras, and that's what documentaries benefited a huge deal more from the digital movement than fiction films. Fiction films took a long time to get used to that, and only I think it's about 5 years of digital fiction filmmaking that has been happening all over the world. So I came back with an idea that what if I did a documentary about a fantasy? And that would be my form.
Right, you were talking about the Tepantere Mate. And it was about the land of nowhere, and you were trying to mix this idea of...
So like everybody else, Bengalis also have that fairy tale, the old fairy tale, which was called Thakurmar Juli, the bag of, the grandmom's bag, And out of this bag came out many stories. So I took I made a composite of those stories. And there's this prince, and then he has to go and save the princess. So if I put it in my life, then the prince for me was a junkie who is in his funk, and he's claiming to be this prince, but nobody would believe him. So in order to make people believe the fact that he is indeed the prince, he takes a journey across the land of nowhere to save the princess after killing the demon.
Okay.
The problem is that there's no princess. The princess is not in danger. There is nobody. But since there's television, TV stations get interested in this and do an interview of the prince, which is seen by the ogre, who now watches television series only. These are all Bengalis. So they've gone to the dogs. All evil people have lost their sense of purpose, basically. So this Rakhosh, who trying to get his mojo back. He says that the story is started again, so I have to also play my part. Then he kidnaps the princess and an adventure ensues.
So it's a similar kind of space to a lot of your other work.
Absolutely,
so what happened with that film then?
Nothing. Obviously, the funders fell out of their chairs when they saw the rough cut, which I quite enjoyed. Throughout the while we were making the film, I was telling everyone that don't worry, this film will never come out. This is never going to be anything at all. So don't be. Let's go for it. And that's exactly what happened. They just stopped it. They got so scared. And there was nothing scary. It was quite funny, actually. But back in the day, this is 2002 now, and this was a nice religious Orthodox family which used to run the studio. They shat their pants. They thought that for 15 lakhs they could get into a festival or something. Anyway, so that was the end of that fiction journey. But meanwhile, what happened was I ran out of money. Obviously, I went bankrupt making this film. So I had about 20,000 rupees in my account, and I realized that I have to go back to working again. There's no other way. So I thought, let's go out with a bang. I have a camera. I have one guy. Let's make another film. And this time make a film which is a challenge film. Like, I have to make these people who think... I had shown Tepantore Mathe also a couple of times very casually in Calcutta, and there was the stunned silence that followed. And immediately in the Calcutta circles, I was known as the guy who cannot make any film whatsoever at any point of time, ever. So just to prove that wrong, I thought that, okay, Bengalis like black and white. Bengalis don't like camera moving. They like still things. So my camera won't move. It will be black and white. It'll have people who they can recognize. Now, who do I know who they can recognize? I know all the musicians. They're all my friends. There's never been a music documentary made. I made this film called Le Pocha in 4 days, which went on to actually make me as a filmmaker. That film was like poorly distributed across Europe, but people started like acknowledging the fact that I could be also probably a filmmaker. One of the major people who supported me was Shyamul Kormukar, who I have to talk about. He edited Tepantore Mathe.
Okay.
He's a very, very, very good editor. He's the dean of the editing department now at SRFTI. And he was the one who informed me about technicals, about film technicals, about editing technicals. And that was great learning. So I was already in this mode that, okay, I can probably make both documentary and fiction. And Shyamul was encouraging me in that. And he asked me to come to this thing called Dockage in 2004. So that started Love in India. Because I went to Dockage not because of anything else, but to please Shyamul, who had already paid my fees. But in Dockage, you need to go with a project.
Right.
I didn't see it necessary for me to take a project because nobody will ever put money into my films. I knew that. I was pretty sure. So when I went there, I saw this European Documentary Network people and what they said, and I was like, okay, this seems like something that I could possibly do. They're talking about pitching. I'm from advertising.
Right.
Last 6 years of my advertising life, that was what I did, pitched. So I'm very good at pitching. So maybe I can do this. I came up with the idea of Love in India that evening, and I pitched it the next morning.
While you were at Dockage?
Yes.
Don't you have to have some supporting materials or something?
Yes, I didn't have anything. I did such a cool pitch that everyone wanted to make that film. But I had nothing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was great. And I got off because this was still the second year of Dockage. Now you can't do this shit. So it was great. But that film, I knew that, okay, I have no idea what film I want to make. But I really want to make this film. And I can only make it if there's European co-production money. Because this is what I want to do for 5 to 6 years. I want to just shoot myself and my girlfriend and wherever we go and whatever we see and try to understand what is this difference between the genders in accessing the idea of love.
And how long did that film take you to make?
Exactly 5 years, actually. We finally
you shot
premiered.
Over a process of 5 years?
5 years, yeah.
Wow. And during that time, you were still doing your advertising?
No. Now, so after that, 2004, I got started on Love in India. But I still didn't, that was the time that I was all in advertising for the second time. So I went back and I spent 2 more years, but these were very productive years. Now I knew what to do. First of all, I knew that I needed to be a producer, not a director, because there were no producers. There was nobody who understood the funding system for an independent film or any independent content at that point of time. And nobody was interested in it. So I thought, if I have to make films, then first I have to make this happen. And in order to do the co-production, I need to be a producer, not a director, because I'll have to then look for a producer. I know that there are no producers. So I have to set up a company. I have to do that. So I started researching, doing some research on that, and then traveling to some of the festivals and the markets while I was still in advertising. And in 2006, I gave it up and moved back once I got my first batch of money into Love in India.
And Love in India was a co-production?
It was a huge co-production. It had 9 co-producers, 9 countries, and ultimately it got distributed to 17 countries.
So there's a theme that's kind of emerging, which is of your own theme, which is of being this loser character, which is what you did with Gandu. I mean, Gandu really was like an event. I think it was an event, on our horizons at least, because we heard about the film and the word itself, and then everybody wanted to watch it. And we all got it illegally, and we all watched it. So it was quite an event. So can you talk about how the whole thing happened? Because I believe there was no script.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was that's why I told you the Le Porcha story, because I think every periodically, I get into this funk mode where we are bankrupt and I have to stop. And since I don't do any commercial work, it's you know how
so it's basically
it's next to impossible to live. You know?
Yeah. So it's basically you have to get pushed into that corner.
Yeah.
And then that's how
I have this little thing left, which is, okay, I have my camera and my editing setup, and I have 2 lakhs in cash. That time it was 20,000. This time it was 2 lakhs. I was like, okay, we have to fold up, but before that, let's make a film. And last time it worked, so this time it should work.
And so you went into it with that attitude, knowing that, okay, probably nobody's going to see it?
Yeah, exactly. That's why we didn't pull any punches. We were like, okay, let's go for it. Nobody's going to watch it. It's shot on a 7D. There's been no film that time till 2011 which was shown in competition sections in festivals that was made on a DSLR. We were the first one.
Wow.
In the world.
Wow, that's incredible.
So nobody thought that would translate into that screen. When we were in Berlin, me and my editor Manas, who's in second year of college, because I had no money to hire technicians, not even Shamol. So I got this guy as an intern, and he turned into my best editor so far. So we were there and we were shitting bricks when we walked into the theater, which we hadn't seen before. Okay, and there we couldn't even go and take a look. Because in big festivals, you have to go from the back and you have the VIP entry and all that. So we couldn't even have a look at how big that thing was. We heard that it was a 700-seater.
Wow.
The screen is 3 stories high. And the 7D monitor is 3.5 inches diagonally. Okay. I'm like, dude, I think we are in for a big problem.
You had no idea what you were going to see on that screen.
No. I really thought that everybody was going to find out now what a scam this was.
Okay, we're going to find out after the break what happened next.
Long, long ago, not in Bethlehem, but in a place nearby, there was a wonderful birth of a huge show, which I like to call Cyrus Says. A show that encapsulates everything in human history, from the first Homo sapien to the last Homo sapien, who's traversed the entire world and then come back to India. This is a show which tells you everything about everything. If you want to know, avoid Google, come to us. It's called Cyrus Says. Get new episodes every Monday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts on. You get 1 banana butter free with every podcast. Right. I'll just check that.
We are back on Anything But Bollywood, and we are talking to Q, and we were discussing how his experience of Gandu opening at the Berlin Film Festival.
Yeah, so we walk in and we sit down, and the bloody screen is 3 stories high. And the 3-inch to 3 stories, that calibration, we were trying, that was what was going on in our mind. So I think I up the intro speech also very badly. But after the film, I was like, yeah, got it.
What was that reaction like at that moment, that after the film screened?
I think we had like 5 sold-out screenings in Berlin. Already people were like falling off their chairs before the film played. So I think we were in a very good place. There was no precedence of anything like this, so everyone was excited for good reason. And thankfully we had made a fairly decent film.
So after that, actually, I wanted to talk about, you traveled with a band called the Gandu Circus, which was really grew out of the film and the music.
Yeah.
And you're very engaged with the music, and I think maybe part of you wishes somewhere that you were a musician. I don't know. So if you can just talk about how you end up working with music and your ideas with that.
Well, for that for that story to unfold, we have to start at the point when Gandu was being conceived. Because there was a plan. There was this, I had a rickshawala friend. I had this, my best friend at a point of time for 2-3 years was a rickshawala. Now this, that story was very much in my mind that someday, one story about rickshawala needs to happen. Also, I'm a big fan of Asian Dub Foundation back in that time. And I'm like very interested in this political rap thing that is going on with, Palestinian rap, Arabic rap, African rap in French. So music was always very much informing me and I always want to know what is the new experimental music that is in the horizon. I have a certain sort of aesthetic that I look out for. So it's very, very easy. It comes to me very organically that music always arrives. So with this very vague sort of concept, I had written a funny and dirty sort of poem. Okay. So one day I was doing a workshop at SRFTI, a documentary workshop, where I found Manas. Manas was in that workshop. Now, I told them that, dude, I don't know anything about filmmaking, so best is that let's make a film. If we make a film together, then we'll get it, right? And best is music, so let's go. I know this band, really cool, and let's shoot this band. So we went to Neil's place, and this was 5 Little Indians, and they did something, we shot something, and very quickly it was fun and over in a flash. After we were chilling and smoking a joint after that, and then Neil is saying, yeah, please tell them that poem. So I started rapping it out. Not really rapping also. I did not know I could rap till that day. Okay. So, and in a flash, they're a band. So they're like, the drummer is like, okay, let's do it like this. And then I'm like, okay, maybe. Okay, cool. Then I got into the spirit of the thing. And I'm telling you, in 15 minutes, we had the track, the first track. And I was like, shit, this is a song, man. This is a song. And we still don't know it's going to be called Gandu, right? So then I have a song, which means my protagonist is a singer, rapper type. I have a friend who's a rickshawala. This is going somewhere, And then I was then again smoking and chilling with this Shurajidda, who's this other hardcore guy that I work with. And we are like, let's make a film about a loser. Yeah, this guy's a loser. So yeah, so good. Now let's think about names for the characters. I'm very bad with character names. Okay, I just cannot count. That's why most of my films characters don't have names. Okay. So I was like, okay, but no name. What do we call him? Narayan. What? So then suddenly we realized, shit, man, this is this guy, if he's such a loser like us, what do people call us? Gandu. So, okay, maybe that's an idea, So that's when, and it didn't take us 2 seconds to decide on it. Oh shit, that guy's name is Gandu, and therefore the film is also called Gandu. And Gandu is a great name for a rapper. That it's so political and it has everything. that started the whole thing. And then once the film came out and suddenly Five Little Indians broke up, probably because of that, Neil was in a desperate situation and we already had 3 gigs. And we were like, shit, what do we do now? He says, no, let's make another band. Let's call it the Gandu Circus. Let's go electro on this. And Gandu Circus was formed, the first like a punk electro rap, which is what post-punk we call it. And then ensued 2 years of blitzkrieg, man. We've played everywhere almost, apart from Africa. And
wow.
We've even played in Transylvania.
Wow. So basically all of this stuff was made up as you went along.
Yeah.
I wanted to move and talk about Tasha Desh. I really enjoyed the film. It's a very feminist film. So a lot of us are not really familiar, at least I'm not, with Tagore's original text. So maybe you can give us some idea of the background and what drove your ideas around that film.
So I made Gandu because after Love in India and 5 years of Krishna coming out of my ears, right, and bhajans and very beautiful melody, I want to kill melody after that. And Gandu came out of that. Post Gandu, I had the reverse happening. And then I sincerely believe that I am a scammer, right? So I have no qualms about it, which is why I feel that every film is my last. Because people will catch on and then they will never give me money to make another one. So I thought sincerely that this is going to be my last film, which is great. So let me do a major one. So what is the majorest that a Bengali filmmaker can do? Rabindranath Tagore. There's no other option. We can't go anywhere else. We are f***ed. So till we grapple with the beard,
right,
we cannot move ahead in our lives. Our lives come to a standstill, which is why I thought, okay, if I have to do that, then let's do this. I knew Tasha Desh from the time I was 3 years old. We had the LP, with this beautiful 2 LP set, which was, I think, made in 76 or 77. And my father had promptly bought that. It had equal dollops of feminism and revolutionary ideas. Tasha Desh was written at a time when the Indian nationalist movement was at its zenith. And it has a long history. Let's not get into that.
Right.
Very little research has been done about Tasha Desh, actually, because most pundits feel that it's a flawed text, which I don't think it is. I thought that, to my understanding, it's the most progressive of anything that he's written. And he kept on writing and kept on changing it till he died. 2 years before he died, he changed it again.
Wow.
So he was keeping it current, which is what he was doing. He had an experimental piece which couldn't be fit into a Nrityanatto, which is dance theatre, or a Gitinatto, which is the song theatre. These two forms, he has written many pieces. But Tasha Desh couldn't be grouped under anything. It was always a separate text. And it was published as a separate text even after Rabindra Rachanavali was published, the whole of his works. So they couldn't fit in Tasha Desh into his collected works, how that script was an aberration. So that really interested me as an artist coming out of aberration. That's my subject. So it fit beautifully. And I saw how I could make it happen with my form. And my form could go one step, closer to what I want to achieve later on. Because now I was going to work with color, which was for me a big thing. I did not know how to deal with color. So which is why it's practically 3 colors. The whole of Tasha Desh is red, white and black. There's no other color that I'm allowing in, so that there's sort of that minimalist approach to color because I don't understand. I would get confused with color then. So it was a trip and a half. By that time, Gandu had so much traction that I had some things to fall back on, some people to call, some people to talk to. And Anurag came on board and told me that we could get NFDC money, which they would never give me, for sure. So that was great. And finally, we did get that NFDC money, which made Tasha Desh possible.
And is that then, so your approach with Gandu was you were kind of making stuff up as you went along. Was that also something then you did with Tasha Desh?
Yeah. That also didn't have a script. And nobody told me anything. Now people are asking me to, script, deadline, I can't understand this shit. We were like doing fine without scripts so far.
So then how do you operate on set? What do you do?
Completely make it up, like as we go along. There are points that there are things that we, like a plot needs a movement, right? For the plot to move, there are certain points that you want to reach.
Right.
So there's these dramatic points.
Right.
I never believed in the 3-act structure even. So there are many problems that I face, which is why I don't want to get into that.
But I actually found Tasha Desh very cohesive narratively. I mean, I don't know, maybe I was...
you were quite demented then.
Yes.
I have no doubts about this.
I don't know, it made sense to me. Like Gandu, I can still say it was very challenging to watch. I still can't say that I necessarily got Gandu, but with Tasha Desh, I felt like it really held together. So obviously...
You can thank Tagore for it, not me.
Okay, that makes sense.
I stretched out the first 3 pages into the whole first half of the film. It's only 3 pages of the original theatre. They just have a conversation, the Rajputra and his friend, and then they go out.
Okay.
And the mom is a set piece, and mom doesn't do anything. She's a total Bengali mom. So I didn't like that at all. So I made her a warrior mom and all that, and stretched out the story, taking from another of his stories, which he wrote when he was 19, which was the seed of Tasha Desh, finally.
And then I heard about your premiere at Rome for Tasha Desh, and you had 2 pregnant actresses with you. So how much of your work is about the spectacle and the way you present your work, the way you present yourself? Is that all calculated?
I think my work is about identity. And I have always had issues with social identity. My original name, my Bengali name, was these 2 words, Kaushik Mukherjee. My mom never called me that, neither did my dad. Complete strangers, mostly strangers that I did not like, which were my teachers, they used to call me that. At home, I had 2 nicknames. In the family, I had 1 more. In the neighborhood, I had 1 more. Effectively, I was living already 4 characters. Right? Every name is a character. Baba is not the same as Kaushik Mukherjee. Right? So, when I started this journey, I had still made Le Pocha with Kaushik, and Kaushik was spelt with Q's at both ends. So, my experiment with this, with my identity had already begun with that film. But since Tepantara Mathe never finished, we never had a credit line in that film. So, therefore, I don't know what I would have done then. But from Love in India, I realized that what I was trying to do was so much outside of my immediate social circumstance that if I were to function with my identity as was decided by that immediate circumstance, I was in a big spot. I wouldn't be able to do what I had to do. Something that people normally ask me is that, and used to ask me much more before, that how do your parents feel about what you do? And you're talking about masturbation and sex all the time. How do people around you handle that? So I keep trying to point out that Q actually doesn't have any parents. He doesn't have anybody. Q came because I watched this film called Visitor Q by Takashi Miike, which is a parable film and bears resemblances to Teorema by Pasolini. It's a Greek fable that has been repeatedly used in theatre and film. But Visitor Q is something else. It's probably the most unwatchable film by Miike, who's made many of them. Like you'll have violent issues while watching. You'll have physical pain, or you might vomit or something.
Definitely not watching it.
No, I don't think you should. But if you can, then it will change your whole being, what it did to me. And I realized that I had to be the central character of that film. Who could create change or who could propagate change because they had no immediate social circumstance.
So you've talked about this in an interview, and you said you actually, you live in the same city as your mom and you actually don't really meet her that often. So is that again by intentionally designed to kind of keep people that are going to enter that social identity of yours? And so is that a necessity for you to maintain your identity as an artist?
Yes, I very much think so. My mom passed away last year, and till her death, it was very, very difficult to actually have a relationship by being the old person. Because a relationship is by default seeks an absolute form. Very few relationships allow the change that. So if 7 years into a relationship with someone, if that person totally changes, you will have problems having the same relationship because it's not the same person anymore. There are very, very few rare relationships where both parties change together or enough and more to sort of balance the dynamics of the relationship, keeping it pretty much close to where it started from. But a mother and child relationship is already fraught, especially Bengali mother and son relationship with tension and drama. So I think I had to consciously do that. And so the social self and the artist self had to be viciously and violently set apart.
And do you think that's something that all artists then have to find a way through to do?
I don't know about all artists. I mean, I'm doing my thing, and most people actually use their own names. So they're pretty good with their identities. They don't have a problem with that. Mr. Chakraborty, let him function. Or Miss Bhanotia, she can do her thing. I can't do my thing being Mr. Mukherjee.
And is it so much of it has to do with the current state of where we are at as a country? I think that maybe you would not have had to be born as Q in another time or place. So the whole idea of censorship and how do you then deal with that? Because you show a lot of sex in all of your films and you're very open about showing male sexuality. So how do you then negotiate all of those issues?
I don't. None of my films have been sent to the censor board. There was a big problem with Gandu because they kept repeatedly asking me to send the film to the board.
Oh,
and I was like, why? The law clearly states that the censor certificate is required if you want to have public distribution of the material. I never wanted public distribution, especially here in this geographical location, through the modes of traditional distribution that seem to have no idea about what this stuff is. So why would you sell chow mein in an Italian restaurant? Would you? Just because it looks similar?
Right. But then, who do you make your films for? Who's the audience? Are you even thinking about the audience?
Yes, I am thinking about the audience. I am thinking about the audience who watches these films that I watch. I watched films sitting in my little apartment in Colombo. It reached me there. I want to show my films to those guys who watch all those films that I watched. And trust me, there are millions of them.
Yeah, I'm sure there are.
All I need to do is to make my films as good as those. Then they will watch it.
And you're on Anything But Bollywood, and we're going to take a break right now, but we'll be right back. We're talking to Q about why the censor board wanted his film.
Hello there, my name is Naveen Narona, and as a gay person in India, I get asked a lot of stupid questions.
Beta, is it LGBT or eligibility?
How do two men procreate?
Bro, is Grindr better than Tinder or what?
We answer all these questions and much more on my podcast, Keeping It Queer, where I talk to individuals from the LGBT community in India and learn about their personal stories. Catch all the episodes on the IVM podcast app or any other podcasting app you like. Till then, keep it queer.
We're back on Anything But Bollywood, and we're talking to Q. And you said the censor board wanted your film. Why would they want your film?
I think because everyone else wanted it. Nobody knew how to get that film. So I think we made a state-level impression. Partially because the trailer had created such a stir, and the fact that it was being shown outside was coming out in the Indian media so much. I'm very grateful that at that point, I think journalism, also Indian journalism, was going through some weird new makeover, as was the artist community. So there were many young journalists who were writing and debating and arguing about the film, for the film, inside the editorial departments. And I think because of the kind of attention that it got, the censor board was wondering what exactly was going on, because there was no precedence of this kind of behavior. Every producer wanted to come out with the film, wants to, even now. Every producer in India, when they make a film, they go to the censor board at some point or the other. It's been 1 year, since people have been hearing about this film, but no producer has come forth. So they were like, what is going on? And they asked me, since I was the producer, why we were not sending the film in. And I told them that we don't want to. We don't intend to publicly distribute this in India.
So this is a good point to kind of ask you about distribution and how do you see your films getting out there, and how what's that journey been like for you?
That was the most difficult part, right? Funding is one difficult part. And I'm totally omitting the fact that you have to make an internationally viable film to be able to be anywhere where we have been. So I'm taking that into account. Okay, you have that merit, but still you have to overcome these two major hurdles. One is the funding, and the other is the distribution. So in some way or the other, I found ways around the funding issue. Every film is a novelty. Every film is a fight. And at the same time, I try to push 10 things for one to get done. But distribution was something else altogether. Because from the time that I started making these films, from Tepantore Mati times, I was into the internet in a big way, and I was using the net as a main research thing, which very few people actually were doing at that point of time. The idea of digital life was something that I embraced totally. So I was pretty sure that at one point of time, technology will do something to distribution as well, like it did to the form. The form changed completely because of the technology.
Right.
And technology overrides every other aspect of anything. Imagine if you had no paintbrush and you were painting with your fingers. You had color but no paintbrush. Then the paintbrush came, everything changed. Scalpel came, everything changed again. With everything, every form of art is reliant on technology. Film is completely reliant on technology. So I was sure that I was a filmmaker because of Apple. I had no other skills. I needed an online system for me to function as a filmmaker. And that pedestrian sort of technology interface is possible. That Apple showed me. And I was pretty sure that down the line at some point, and it took 15 years. Took 15 years it has been like from the early days of VOD, when Mozilla came out with a VOD option, and then Vimeo tried. There were many, many, many people who tried, and they all spectacularly failed. Till this Netflix thing happened. And quietly this was happening somewhere. It was part of the whole... Hulu was already there. Netflix was nowhere. And suddenly one day, there was a change. And I was kind of predicting this change for a long time. Which is why, being a producer, we held on to all the IP for all our films. Which is not something that any other filmmaker in India can say. Films belong to producers, you know that,
yes,
right?
I know that. Scripts, even scripts. You said
everything.
A script, everything.
You just
can't,
give
there's
up.
no way to own your IP at all.
Exactly,
So
you're slaves.
I've written something, and now I'm like, this is mine, and I want to own it, but nobody will offer you that option.
Yeah.
There's
It's
nothing,
not there
zero.
on the,
So now I'm like, you know what? I don't know if I want to even sell.
Yeah. which is something that globally you saw that it was a relevant argument to make. So I was like, okay, then if a market is not equipped to handle my what I want to give it, then why do I need to operate in that marketplace? I need to find a market that's conducive to what I'm selling.
Right.
I'm selling earthen lamps. Why should I sell it at a fish market or that metaphor of the Italian and the Chinese, because they look the same. So I had to wait for the Chinese shop, right? And the Chinese shop came, and we were the first ones off the block. That it's linked to the Netflix acquisition. And finally Netflix acquired all my films. And they're now all online.
Oh, okay. They've acquired all of your films.
Yeah, and you can now watch anything, and they're completely uncensored. And there's no compromise there.
Right. Yes, this is a good point to talk about Brahman Naman, which I really loved. I think all of us here loved it. Naveen is smiling away.
Much to learn.
So let's talk about that film. I loved it. It was superb. I mean, I was expecting the penis. So I don't know. So this is what I want to know. That, say, like, after you've been shocked, right? Then what? Then so is that a consideration to first shock? But I mean, Brahman Naman worked for me irrespective of anything else. So are those considerations that you make?
See, shock is relative.
Right?
Shock is relative to the content that you're providing to the kind of audience that it reaches out to. Now, with the Gandu, the intent was all my films work on the basis of shock. Shock is a tool that is very much a part of the anarchist conduct, because the idea of anarchist art is based on the fact that people are in deep ennui, and the system is murky to the point where nothing seems discernible. You don't know what is good or bad anymore. Because you're not allowed to have 3 minutes of thought about it. Before that can happen, you will be bombarded with something else. I think that's far more disruptive than the shock that we would employ as artists in our work of art.
Right.
The shock that you're constantly having to deal with, that the mainstream distribution forces upon you, that's far more acidic. Whereas the disruptive shock that I'm employing in my work has very little commercial motivation. Because there was a dick in Gandu, 4 million Indians watched it. I didn't get a penny. It was for free. The point was not that. So in most of my conversations, this point is lost completely because Indians are so new to this market economy thing that we are in the throes of early capitalism. We have no clue right now, and I don't know when we will have this clue, that life can be valued by other things than money. Especially in a city like Bombay, which whenever I come here, I am reminded this at every
constantly
step.
It's crazy.
From the auto guy
bonkers.
to the person I'm meeting.
It's completely bonkers. And when you have a conversation with somebody outside of the city, you just realize you're like, oh, we are bonkers.
Absolutely. and I mean, you can't do anything because if you have to live here, you will be affected. And then if you don't retaliate or you don't react to it or in some way internalize this fact, it's a fact that we are right now a highly capitalist society. We don't understand anything else if it's not valued with money. And this is something that is going to really be a problem for us in the near future if we are not careful, because we are raising an entire generation on that thought, which hasn't gone very well for the other people, you know who I mean. So very quickly you'll see the other side. And we are a very diverse country, and something like money can actually unite it, and they found it out.
So actually, this whole thing of being in Bombay versus being in Kolkata, which is where you've kind of created your space, at least that's where you did. So what is that difference like, and in terms of a context of the country?
I think that was critical, that at that point of time when I decided to move away from advertising into the world of filmmaking, I knew that I had the wherewithals to go pretty much anywhere. If I had gone to New York or London or Toronto and tried to do the same thing there, it might have been easier a little bit, because at least we would have wasted little time in trying to make people understand what you're doing.
Right.
It took me 5 years just to do that, right? Then you start the conversation.
Right.
So that time could have been saved. But what I would have lost is the connect, the fact that the fight was here. And for me, it's always been very political. I'm not doing this for anything else but my sense of what artistic politics is. And I'm very much a political person, and all my work is politically motivated. Is that sense of politics an absolutist form? I don't think so, because that's what I want to challenge. I come from a great lineage of Bengali leftist political artists. I draw very heavily from there. In fact, my last documentary was about Navarun Bhattacharya, who was the last great anarchist who I've watched very closely and learned much from. So I'm not. While that is going on, I think it's a critical idea that we need to establish as artists functioning in India as to where we stand, because obviously everything around us, and not only in this country but around the world, we are going to witness a huge political change in the next few years.
Yeah, and in this climate, I don't know, maybe in this world, I think any art you make at this point is political. Any art you make, anything you make is absolutely 100% political.
Well, art, again, when you make art in the guise of a product, does it have any politics left in it? That will be always challenged. And we live in a highly complex, postmodernist, analytical environment. Please, let's understand. Every political move will be watched carefully and labeled. But the point is that I think what I was trying to get at is that if you have the agenda of the artwork is to appear at a marketplace with a purpose of being sold, then you're making a product. So a product has very little political agency because it's fueled by the marketplace and is motivated by profit.
But then in that same turn, doesn't then co-production as well drive a kind of marketplace in terms of the funding and all of that?
Without any profit motivation. Okay. Why are you doing co-production? Mostly public funds are used in co-production. In the European co-production system. You can call crowdfunding also a sort of co-production, right? People have been trying over the last 5 years. People have been trying to find different ways of, offsetting this equity-based artwork creation mode. This model just does not work because you're finally indebted to the market. You're answerable to the market.
Right.
What if your product doesn't sell? Right?
Yeah,
so you won't be able to return the money.
Yeah.
Then the money person is upset. The money person will have some agenda. And in a situation like ours right now, where a certain kind of philosophy is taking center stage, the market is bound to be affected by that.
Yeah, 100%.
So then how do you exist as an artist with a voice, with an independent voice?
So I wanted to talk about multitasking and how you have to, as an artist and a creator and all of that, and even as a filmmaker, you always take on multiple roles. So, and that is very much, I think, a result of your work, which you've kind of said clearly. So, but can you talk about that whole idea of multitasking and also, right, actually the reason I wanted to talk about it was because you said you do 10 things, right?
Yeah.
And maybe one will pan out.
Yeah.
So is that how it is all the time?
It's a very easy thing to explain. When you have your computer open, when you have your laptop open, how many windows are normally open?
A lot.
Yeah. So I've taken a general, vote whenever I'm asked this question. And I do this presentation about digital cinema in many colleges and mostly educational institutions. And I take this poll of how many normally how many people windows are open, and the average is 7. Okay, that's how many windows are open, because you also have to consider within your internet browser you have 4 to 5 open.
Right.
So you average that to 2, then you have Photoshop, then you have this, then you have that. Whoever's in whatever. Somebody has an Excel sheet, somebody has Microsoft Word. So as I was saying, that at a certain point of time you would work on one particular, or you're focusing on one thing, but there are all these other windows that are open in the back end. I think that's the normal thing right now, and all of us are leading that life. And as I said before, I was an early convert into the digital life.
Right.
I have embraced this. I have always liked this.
Been like this.
I have. When I was 14, I read Milan Kundera, and there was a line that I had written on my bedroom wall, which I used to wake up to. It said, "Do I contradict myself? Surely I do. I am large. I contain multitudes." And I thought that was so.
That's a lovely line.
That's just nails it. Milan Kundera has answers to most of the things. The other whatever he doesn't answer, Tom Robbins does it. Also, from a very early childhood, I was really inspired by people who were alternative in their, not only their work, but their lifestyle as well. And they all used to have to do a lot of things. Why? Because they were hustling. A hustler has to do a lot of things, because you don't know which hustle will work.
Right.
Because you're hustling.
Yeah.
Nobody wants it. Nobody wants what you're doing, but you somehow have to slip through.
Right. I wanted to talk about shifting genres, and you shifted to horror in between, which was Ludo. So why did you decide to move into that space?
It was a calculated decision, because I was tiring of the art house sort of genre. That's also a genre,
right?
Art house.
Art
just
house,
that doesn't sell.
Right.
That's the genre that doesn't sell. So whatever doesn't sell is art house. So basically, art house, non-narrative, non-linear narrative, trippy stuff and all that. So that is something that I was interested in for sure. But actually, post that European thing that we talked about, that was my early inspiration. From the early 2000s, when I became a filmmaker, the inspiration shifted totally to Eastern cinema. And that's the time that the Japanese and Korean extreme movement happened. And like Visitor Q, I have been totally inundated by that.
Okay, you have to educate me, because my film education is like minus. Like you have to assume it's minus, and my memory is even beyond that.
So what happened is that there was this London-based distribution company called Tartan Video. They suddenly unleashed upon the world a cheap video, straight-to-video sort of alternative, where these extreme Japanese and Korean cinema started being distributed by them around the world. Why? Because they restarted a thing that was quite a popular idiom back in the 60s and the 70s in Japan. And Korea had just found through its National Film Institute, money to make alternative cinema. And there were some policy changes and government changes that led to the Korean movement. Japan already had a great history in this, and they just simply found these new directors came up who were just killing it, like Miike, like Kiyoshi Kurosawa or Sion Sono. And in Korea, it was Kim Ki-duk and Park Chan-wook, So one after the other, there was these stunning films. And they were all in this extreme bracket, which meant either they were thriller, gory, horror.
Right. So this is the one that I've not seen. Like I've seen the Koreans. I will not see the Japanese.
Correct.
There's no chance that's happening.
Koreans have an art house thing.
The Koreans, I know about the Koreans.
Yeah, but even if you see The Isle, it's grotesquely violent, but they have a different way of dealing with violence, more arty, and Japanese don't care shit. Like, they don't give a flying for European art aesthetics, where Koreans give, they're slightly respectful of that. And we are the colonial, madly, so we can't do anything. Tarkovsky. Especially in Bengal. So anyway, I was super inspired by that. And so I was always in the It's only that it took me 7 years to figure out how to do a horror film in India.
What were the challenges?
It's a huge challenge. We don't believe in absolute. When have you last got scared of a ghost?
Right.
Like truly deeply scared, like freaked the out.
Right.
You don't, because you don't believe in the devil like a Christian.
Right.
So whenever there's no absolute pure evil. Evil is always malleable. They're like, it's okay, you could be friends with them, just talk to them nicely and then, or do some puja, or just do something and it'll be okay.
This is good for relationships, applicable across all of them.
So that's why I think it was very tough to get a sense of what would be truly scary for us. And then horror is great because it's always metaphoric. Why did this movement happen? Because the studios which came up were horror studios who were giving money to these guys. Nobody else wanted to fund them.
And it's cheaper.
It's cheaper, so therefore there was much less to lose, which was always my agenda.
Right.
Like I make really cheap films. Even Brahman Naman is super cheap. It's a period film with no period prop. You know, in Ludo there are only 2-3 set pieces.
How much do you make Brahman Naman for?
Brahman Naman was, I think, a little over 3 crores.
Okay.
Yeah, that is nothing because in India, the union rules are that if you make an English film, you have to pay 4 times.
Oh.
Yes, correct. So the system makes it impossible for you to operate, So
this is why English films don't get made.
Don't get made. Very simple.
Oh, here's the answer.
Yes.
Thank you. I've been asking this question
and
you've answered it.
So if you shoot in any major city or anywhere the unions have jurisdiction on, you can't do it.
But if you shoot a Marathi film, for example, in Maharashtra...
Then it's easy, cheap. Bengali film in Bengal.
Right.
Hindi film in Bengal, double. English film in Bengal 4 times. Okay, so we have antiquated rules not only in censorship but also in production. We are antique. We are a very antique country. We are not a very progressive country, let's face it, right? So therefore, it's futile to think about. So in that circumstance, this budget was nothing. And that's why we couldn't even hire a single prop, which is a period prop, like a car or something, those kind of things that people do to push the production value. Yeah. So we shot in Mysore. Thankfully, it's a heritage town, so there's very little art that we had to do. I shot everything against a wall.
Yeah.
So there's nothing period about anything. And 2-3 scenes where we could do a little bit of production value. We just made it look cool. And that's my job is that. My job is to make sure none of the tattered bits show. And and there's a lot of places to learn this from. People have done this throughout the ages in cinema. How they've used things lying around, used resources at hand to make the most of it.
And so since we're talking about Brahman Naman, I want to talk about the casting as well, because that was amazing. So can you share with us how you went about that and if you had any challenges through that process?
Yeah, it was very difficult to cast for Brahman Naman. For the first time I was getting out of my own... I was working as a theatre unit. We were working with me and my actors and my crew. We used to practically live together, work together, eat together,
this is how
not
many of
take
you?
money. The core group was about, depending on the time, 7 to 12. And the extended team was about 20-25 people. And these people were only doing this. And then we got very little money in exchange. But we got enough to get what we really needed. Okay, and we would have food, community food. So people could eat, people could crash, and we had to work all the time. But it was great fun also, and all the mal was free. Mal was on the house.
Lovely.
So therefore, everyone was happy. So it was a good setup for some time, but obviously everything has an expiry date. And then Brahman Naman came along. We didn't really talk about Brahman Naman properly because I want to tell you how it worked.
Yeah, and actually it was a film that for the first time it was a script that you didn't write. Yeah, so we should get started
so one day I got this mail in my mailbox from a certain Steve Barron that, dear Q, we have been developing a script. would you want to have a look at it? We would really like you to consider directing it. Which is a very polite English way, way that they normally talk to directors who are used to this. So firstly, I got shocked because nobody had told me this before, that I could be hired as a director. Second is that, who the is Steve Barron? How did he get my email ID? So then I realized the script is by some S. Ramachandran, who I've never heard of. Then I write back, and in a couple of mails I realize that's a pseudonym. The person who's written is Naman Ramachandran, who I know very well for the last 5 years, and he never told me this shit. So then I wrote to Naman saying, what the is going on? Is this your script, and who's this Steve Barron? So Naman in his normal tone replied, sire, if you do not know who Steve Barron is, then I doubt if our relationship can continue. So I said, this I up badly. So Google. And then Steve Barron, dude. He's the dude. He made Beat It.
Oh, really?
He made everything. He's the 80s guy. From Aha to David Bowie, from Madonna to U2, he's made the most seminal music videos of that time.
Oh, wow.
His first film that he directed was Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles.
Oh.
I was like, okay, right. So I should die now. And before reading the script, I was like, okay, yes, thank you very much, I'm on. And what do we do next? Reading, yeah, sure, reading. So then I read the script and it was super funny. Obviously, it was Naman's life, and though we are legally bound to say that nothing is true and all that. But so I could totally see the whole thing, because that was my time also. Right? Naman and I are pretty much the same age. I had many quizzer friends. They come to Calcutta. He's half Bengali also. Okay. So there are a lot of Bengali elements in that. Right. The only thing I did not know about was alcohol. Because I never drank. And this film had no drugs. I was like, shit, dude.
That is a problem.
How do we do this? Which is when I started drinking.
Oh.
And now I'm an alcoholic, proudly. I can say I have outdrunk Naman on 2 occasions.
Wow.
Who's my master, obviously.
It's very method.
It's very method, it's very meta. About the casting, it took a year to cast Brahman Naman. So it was that long.
Wow.
And but it was great fun also. Like, for instance, Sid Mallya. Okay, so we are casting all the losers of Bangalore. We're like, shit, man.
It was really good. Very good.
Sid to play Sid before he was born. It was so much fun. And we were very wary of what he would turn out to be. But he was super fun, man. He came, he was also very nervous. On the first day of the workshop, I thought he would be late. He was the first guy to arrive. And I thought he hadn't come because there was no car out or bodyguard or things outside. So then it transpired that the guy has come in, parked the car 3 lanes, away from the place, because he was sure he was going to get ragged.
Oh.
Right? Because everyone was getting... Like, me and Naman are ruthless. We would rag everyone. And it's super bad. I mean, also we don't adhere by any rules. You know, all of my films have passed the Bechdel test. Even Brahman Naman and Dandu. But in the situation where we are making the film during production, it might seem extremely hostile because of the way we conduct ourselves. But it's great fun also. It's a process. That's the method. So casting for the main characters was something. And the second thing was casting the cameos, because there's so many of them. Like starting from Bernie, who became a major character after we got Denzel, and we were like, shit, this is great.
Denzel was too good.
Yeah, so we should have him. Like, Bernie was there. Bernie's role was extended because we got Denzel, and such a powerful actor. And then the rest of the cast, like Biswa, then the guy who plays Henry, Karthik Iyer, who heads an advertising agency and was perhaps the first, one of the first stand-up comics of Bangalore, who nobody heard out because there was no comedy at that time. Nobody was interested in it. That was like 10 years back or something. And Sid, of course. And then Ramu's dad, who's Naresh, who's like a major architect. He's the guy who's the lead campaigner which stopped the bridge to build this flyover that they're trying to do. It's still going on, but he's the major anti-bridge guy, and he's quite a champ. Basically, he restores palaces.
Wow.
He's super good, and he's got great ganja all the time, and he's a really nice guy. So we had fun.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about you moving in a truly independent space, and you've carved this very independent space for yourself. What has been the trade-off?
Trade-off?
Yeah.
The trade is off.
The trade is off, yeah.
Trading is not happening very much. Otherwise, I don't think I have a great life. In spite of the anxiety,
right,
which is a daily situation, which I'm sure everyone is anxious to lose their jobs or anything.
Right.
I'm like, I don't have a job and I'm anxious. So,
yeah,
but I think I have a crazy life, and I've met Takashi. I've almost met all the people I was inspired by.
Really? That's amazing.
What else do you want?
That's amazing.
I've met my gods in flesh. I've hung out with them, and I'm super happy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's huge.
I can play music when I want to. Finally, people are conceding to the fact that, I fail. I mean, I'm not really a musician, but I'm, hustling that as well. It's great.
Sounds fun. So, having said that, on the flip side, there is a financial element to it. So, how do you manage the financial risks of making the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, so that's something that is a really huge issue. Like, not only in terms of funding films, but running a company, running an organization that just does this and doesn't take any donations or, That's been something of an experiment that is... So most experiments are supposed to be failures because then they can't be called experiments, right? So I take it as it comes. We did a great deal with that. The Netflix deal really helped us as a company, as producers, to fortify ourselves and to answer people that it was viable, but it doesn't solve all our problems, right? Right now, we are in a bit of an economic situation, or like
always
again, and I think it'll be part of my life.
Right.
Like I would just like to go back to the one when we were discussing the last time that I said that if you don't treat money as the be-all and end-all, maybe it'll be easier to operate, because economics is considered first. What if it's not considered the first? Well, if in my mind I can reduce the relevance of economics to, let's say, priority 7, it still remains in the top 10. But it doesn't eat away at your mind like a vulture. So
to shift gears, then, your collaboration has been a very important part of what you do. You have the same set of collaborators. So what are those relationships like? And you've had a long association with the producer, Celine Loop. So if you could talk about that.
I met Celine because the first time we showed Gandu in Calcutta at SRFTI, again there was the stunned silence after the screening was over, and Celine was the first person to clap. That's how I met her. And she was a lawyer who was running a legal company. She's from Belgium. And when we were hanging out, I said, this is what you should be doing. We need producers, and you're a lawyer. We are into IP. I'm into IP. I want to do this. And she was immediately interested. And she didn't know what she was signing up for and regrets half of it. But the other half was really crazy. And we did massive work over the last 6 years. Celine has just recently got married to somebody who worked with us. So we clearly do not follow protocol in terms of who you're inside your work. Because I think because we make sexual films or talking about sex all the time, there's an energy that we create in that functioning, and it does translate into mad relationships. Sometimes they don't work. But yeah, we've had a very fruitful relationship over the last 6 years. Now it's time to move on. Celine just got married. She wants to have a baby. And this life is very tough. You know, you're working every day and you're not getting much.
Right.
So this is something that you can do up to a point if you... So she is going to continue fighting for Belgian-Indian co-production, which we don't have a treaty on yet signed. So because she's a lawyer, she wants to focus on that and focus on her marriage a little bit, go back to Brussels every now and then, meet her parents, all the things that she hasn't been doing. And I have since moved to Goa, so we are no longer functioning from Calcutta anymore. I am going to stay in Goa and operate from there.
All the artists are moving to Goa?
Yeah, because I think we are all feeling really scared in wherever we are. And we want to have a peer group. And that's what's happening in Goa, which is very, 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 very cool.
Yeah.
Because you come out of your house and you meet someone whose work you do not understand. And that's so good, man. And in Calcutta, I just was dying because after Nobarunda, there are like 2 people left who I can talk to. You know, who you can learn from, who's thinking really so far outside the box that you are shocked. You know. So in Goa, I get that every day. And I've made friends with them. So I can occasionally have... Yeah, so all the alternative artists are moving to Goa. No, I'll just add, they're just not artists. They're people who are really, really pushing the boundaries. So it's a good environment to be in. We could do a Berlin but there's BJP now, so we don't know what to do.
Many issues now.
Yeah.
So what's next for you?
There are, over the last, since Brahman Naman and Sundance and Ludo came out also sort of the same time, so I have a really trying time traveling and all, we wasted a lot of time there. But after that, for the last almost a year, I've been writing and developing a lot of things with my colleagues, other collaborators. And now we're ready with a lot of ideas, and we are about to embark into production from hopefully next month.
Oh, okay, that's exciting.
First off is another horror film. This time I can really do a genre job. The last Ludo was made with very, very paltry budget. Though we got a great prosthetics guy from France who was a friend and helped us out. But still, just the technical part of horror is so important to get it right.
Yeah.
That I had to take a call between having 5 scenes or having 2 really great scenes. So I went for the 2 great scenes and put them in the middle. So it was an experimental horror. But I am really interested in the genre and to do a proper genre film. And Ludo, the franchise for Ludo was bought by Phantom and 2 other entities who I can't talk about right now, but they're big studios who back horror. So we are seeing a kind of a thing, that Nikatsu thing happening.
That's amazing.
So I'm very, very,
That's exciting.
I'm looking forward to that. Hope it works out the way we think it.
That sounds pretty exciting. Okay, I usually wrap up my shows by asking for a general advice for filmmakers, but I want some specific advice. So what advice do you have for like filmmakers or actors on how to shoot a sex scene? It's very important to me, see?
Very good.
I need to know.
I have not been asked this question. I'm thankful that you deem me an expert on this subject.
Yes, I didn't ask for general advice.
First of all, get them horny.
Okay.
Yeah, because if they're not horny,
it's gonna show.
It look terrible.
Yeah.
It look forced and terrible.
Okay, so then that's pretty much the end of it. That's it.
Yeah, just get them off, man.
Yeah,
that's the director's job, to make atmosphere, not a film. The film is dependent on many other factors. You know, there are many other people involved. So the director's job is, we are not in that, not Tarkovsky sir, who knows everything.
Right.
You know, so we are lesser mortals. Our job is create the atmosphere. I'm like a DJ. So I have 90 minutes. I have a 90-minute set. I have to make you dance. That's my job.
Okay, cool. That's very good advice. Thank you. So we usually wrap it up by asking for film recommendations. I don't have one today, so if you have more than one, please hold forth.
If you can visit a queue.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely sounded...
Well, I mean, a film that I just watched recently and it's beautiful is Park Chan-wook's new film. And it's not really horror, so you might be able to go through it. And it's ultra feminist. It's about two girls.
Sounds
beautiful.
Perfect.
Yes, it's called The Handmaiden.
Yeah, I read about it.
You have to watch it. It's just so good. It's just so emotional and like vulgar, like beautiful. You know the 9 rasas, right? And we have Japanese Navarasas. All of the Orient has it. Don't think it's ours, right? Japan has it. China has it. You know. So this horror genre, this whole thing comes under Vivatsa,
which means
grotesque. It's a rasa. So it's not about ugly.
Right.
It's a whole world. Like Shringar, Vivatsa has a whole world. It has its own gods and goddesses. It has its own idioms and metaphors and nuances and breaks and poetic allusions to what is Vivatsa, what is grotesque. And I think my work is about that. Like I was saying, I like the ugly mother. That's because it's Vivats. It's a rasa. It's part of our life. It's part of our world. And not much space or time is ever given to it.
So, sorry, what was the name of the movie?
The Handmaiden.
This is by Park Chan-wook.
Park Chan-wook, Handmaiden.
I think that's a good place to wind up. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks for having me.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Sorry to say, but there's been a slight delay due to the apocalypse having suddenly begun. As you can see, there's death, destruction, and chaos taking place all around us. But don't you worry, food and drinks will be served shortly, and I would recommend checking out
IVM Podcasts
to get some of your favorite Indian podcasts. We'll keep you going till this whole thing blows over. Thank you.